So ladies and gentlemen, Katie Knowles. Hey.
Thank you, Ed. That was a great introduction. So now that you know my luck's about to run out, no. Oh, now you've cursed me. I did almost trip getting on the stage, but anyways. So let me see where to start. I hadn't done as much as I wanted to with software-defined radio, and one of the best ways to learn is to put yourself under pressure to learn it, right? So now I've got to teach you all about it. I won't claim to be an expert, but I think there's going to be a lot of fun things that we can find here. One of the things I like doing the most is bridging the gap between material that is considered simple and material that might be more intimidating. And I'm hoping that this might help you out with that if you've been curious about software-defined radio at all. So first of all, let me see. Oh, is this going to work for me? Uh-oh. I'm going to have to give my presentation blind. Oh, there we go. So who knows what a software-defined radio is SDR. I already did that part. Who's ever played with an SDR? Show of hands. Cool. Who's been curious about playing with SDRs before? Awesome. So I think that's a good mix. Maybe if you weren't curious before, you'll be curious by the end of this. It's a great area to just play around with things if you're looking for new projects in areas that you might not get to see in the workplace as often. I think it's a great way to practice the hacker mindset in areas you might not get to touch on as often. The other thing is that RF is all around us. I'm sure you all know there's just signals all over the place barraging us all the time these days, and yet we hardly ever take the time to investigate what they are, what they're doing, and how, what data they're carrying in the world around us. So there's almost these this wild terrain with different types of signals that do different things with different rarities, and some are easier to catch and some are more difficult. I wonder if we could catch them all? Sorry, no, I'm not. So anyways, with this presentation, I'm hoping to give you a quick overview of some of the RF concepts you might want to know if you're getting into SDR. And then we're just going to go on our little safari trip. We're going to look at a couple different signals that I just found around my house. Just pick up a random thing, go, hey, this probably has signals in it, wonder what it does, and go from that to knowing how it works and what it does. And even though these signals are really simple, and most of the time, the tone I'm taking here is pretty fun, right? It's lighthearted, we're looking to enjoy ourselves. But a lot of these electronics are vulnerable to things like replay attacks. So if someone had that signal like me, and they played it again, they could control that device. And with RF devices, there's a lot of proprietary ways of sending data out there right now. It's getting better. You've got your Bluetooth and your Zigbee and things like that. But it's not always going to be the case that that thing that guys are using to operate a crane on the floor is secure. It might just be that nobody's been able to look into it yet, which is kind of a scary thing. But we're not here to talk about fear, we're here to have fun. And once we've wrapped that up, we'll continue the adventure a little bit with some resources you can look into if any of this has caught your eye. A little bit about me. I'm Katie Knowles. I'm a security consultant and pen tester with MWR Infosecurity. I'm an RF enthusiast for a long time, and I'm always an InfoSec explorer. All right, so just to get these out of the way, some of you might know this already, some of you might not, but just to blur through it so we're all on the same page. RF travels as electromagnetic waves, so there's the whole spectrum from things that are gonna, give you bad effects in your body, warm you up in weird ways, to the light you see every day, to signals that submarines might send in the night that you're never gonna understand or see. And there's a subset of that spectrum that's all radio frequencies. They're all traveling the same speed, so they just vary in how long the wave is. And another way of referring to that is the frequency of it. So if it's got a longer wavelength, we say it has a lower frequency. And if it's got a shorter wavelength, it's got a higher frequency. The high frequencies are where you're going to see a lot of things that you're interacting with today for local communications. A way to remember the relationship between the frequency and the wavelength is just if you multiply them, it'll always come back to the speed of light, which is what all those waves are traveling at. There's a couple different ways. We're talking about control signals today, first of all. And there's a couple different ways that they relate back to what you might be familiar with already. So AM and FM radio, for instance. There's amplitude shift keying, which is based on the amplitude modulation. And there's frequency shift keying, which is based on the frequencies. So in that first picture at the top, you can see that there's two different lengths of pulse. There's a short pulse, and that one's are 0, and there's a longer pulse, and that one's 1. So it's almost like Morse code, right? But you only have a 1 and a 0. You don't have a whole alphabet to tell a device a series of bits that it can translate into a command. And then below that, it's the exact same 1s and 0s. It's just you have a lower frequency for the 0s and a higher frequency for the 1s. This on-off keying that you see up here is really common, and that's actually what both of the signals we're looking at today will end up relying on. Where do those signals fit in that we're going to be looking at? The white boxes that we've got down here on the spectrum show some of the bands that we're going to be looking for our mystery wild signals today. Those are the areas that they tend to lurk around, and they're common signals, so they're all over the place. But down at the lower frequencies, we've got AM radio that you might be familiar with. Any ham radio operators in the audience? Cool. So I think it's 10 meters all the way up to 80 meters are in that band over there. So if you do any HF communication, it's all, happening right there. We've got FM radio interspersed with television, and then we start getting cell signals and just all this noise and data and basically the modern world at the higher end of the frequency ranges. And those white boxes, I've got them outlined here. So if you're ever on a signal hunt, this is where you're going to find most of the, especially the control signals today. That ISM there is for industrial, scientific, and medical frequency bands. I went and looked this up. I was curious, how did these come to be? It turned out they needed to coordinate frequencies for microwave ovens. And so they were saying, well, we need to know where all of these ovens are operating. So why don't we set some spectrum aside for them? And I guess if other devices want to use those frequencies, and as long as they don't interfere, they're cool too. And so it was funny that this almost afterthought became so much of what we use today. These bands are really common for local communications and controls. I'm sure you're all familiar with 2.5 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz for our Wi-Fi these days. A lot of the world runs on that. And then that unlicensed slice down below, it's not entirely unlicensed. It's actually government spectrum, but there's a little bit of it where they kind of did another, well, I guess if you want to put a signal there, you can put one there too. So that's all the boring lecture stuff I've got before our adventure. We're prepared, we're ready to go. We've got our backpack and our tools. Go out the door, find some wild signals. Today, for these examples, we're using the RTL-SDR. I love it. It's a really cheap radio receiver. It's about $30. And it can't transmit, you can't send any signals with it, but it's a great way to get started and explore things on a budget. Radio stuff can get expensive really quick, and I think this is a way to have a lot of fun without any risk monetarily. There's also a lot of amazing open source projects supporting these technologies. So on Linux, which we'll be looking at today, there's GQRX for tuning things around. And then a couple different programs we'll be looking at that revolve around the Canoe radio packages. In Windows, there's some great stuff as well. I'm not going to bother listing them off. I'll leave that as an adventure to the reader, but whatever your operating system flavor, there's a way to have fun with it. Cool. All right. Signal number 1. Who's ready to guess the signal? It's a mystery, right? You can't tell what that is at all. Nah. So this is a remote controller. I found it in my house, surprise. I'm really lazy. I don't know about you guys. I hate having to get up and turn the lights on and off. I could be just amazingly technically advanced and talk to my house and let it control all my systems and not burn down my office like some people here who are really smart and clever about this. Or I could order a $30 remote on Amazon, right? So, but as we'll learn, I might not have the best idea. You may remember that in Mr. Scotus's lecture, he stressed the importance of building security in as you use your tools. And I've always been curious about this remote. There's no way this thing can be secure, right? It cost me $30 for 2 remotes and 2 plugs on Amazon. You put the plug into the wall, and it receives a signal from this remote. I can turn on or off switches 1 through 4, or I can turn all of them on and off at the same time. And it's great. I can control my lights across the house, do whatever I want. But it can't be that complicated, right? All right, so I did some investigation into it. I've got this remote in my hand. I'm looking at it. I'm like, we've got it, right? Here it is. I caught the signal. I know what it is, right? But I'm turning it over, and there's nothing I can really do from here. I'm stuck. It would be great if we had a tool, some kind of Encyclopedia or a signal dex of some kind. You take it out, and you point it at the remote, and you say, what is it? Tell me. And it says, oh, I found that signal. Here's what it looks like. Here's what frequency it's at. Here's, everything you wanted to know. I don't think something like that could exist. No? Well, it does. It's called RTL-433. This is an amazing command line tool that's out there for everyone to use. It does work in areas outside of 433 megahertz, but it was originally developed for use in that area. It's got a bunch of devices that it can already identify that people have contributed translations for. So if you've got a specific remote or a weather station, and it finds that, it can tell you, oh, it's saying the temperature is this and the weather is cloudy. My remote isn't well known enough to have a definition like that, but what it can do is if I run it with the -A flag, and it will look for everything that it sees within the range of frequencies that it defaults to. So right now, it's looking around 433.92.0000 hertz. So 433.9 megahertz, basically. And that -Q flag is just quiet, so I can fit all of the output here to show you, because otherwise it'll list all the definitions it knows. But anyways, it's listing all these bits out in hex and in just the ones and the zeros you can see on the right. And this is great. I push a button, I get a number, it does all the translation for us. It's like I didn't even need to lecture you about all that RF stuff at first. But that does come up. It's not in vain. Thank you for listening. So awesome. This is kind of like the cooking show part. We've got how we know what the signals are, and then we've got all the tabulation of what the signals mean in the translation, and I've kind of taken the signal off screen and put everything in a table and come back and been like, ta-da, everything's perfect, it's done, this took no time at all. And here I've tabulated the on and the off state for each button that I've got, and I've looked for patterns. The spaces that you see up there are completely arbitrary. In reversing these things, it's basically best guess, it's your judgment. There's not really any standardization in simple protocols like this. So I noticed that 0011 and 1100 at the end of every command lines up with the on and the off. Cool, so we've got to start here. I also noticed for each switch, it's got a specific code, and it's different for each switch. So we know how it's saying which switch to use. It's got this consistent preamble in the beginning, so we're going to say maybe that's a remote ID. It's telling the switch which part, I'm the remote you should be listening to. And the 1 light, 2 light thing, I'm mixed on that, but it looks like the 0111, the 11 down there in the second space section, it only shows up for all, so we'll say that's for all. So bam, we've reversed it. It doesn't feel very official, but that is kind of how nosing through these things goes. There's no specification for this cheap remote. But if we take our translation around full circle, we've got the boxed command there saying this is remote, whatever its name is, turn on switch 2. Awesome, we did it. Now we've caught a signal. We've gone from having something in my hand to knowing what it does and how it operates. And if I had a transmitter, and followed all that transmission advice from maybe the hardware bridge talk, then, so a large Faraday cage and the appropriate testing environment, these commands didn't change at all while I was testing them. I can push those buttons as many times as I want. It's the same thing. So remind me to put these away whenever you guys are in the neighborhood. Please don't come near my house and turn my lights on and off. And this is where that security part comes in. This is where I lose out. So I only spent $30 on my fancy home automation, but it's not secure, and I also can't talk to it. So I'm still a little heartbroken about that. Cool. One signal down. Next signal. So get up from my sofa where I'm playing around with computers, open up a drawer, and we've got this. It's totally different, right? This isn't a remote. It's something. No, it's a remote. So this is a fan remote, and this controls the speed of the fan and the light. You might have seen something like this. You might have something like this. And again, I turn it over and over in my hands. I open up the battery hatch. This one didn't have an FCC ID on it, which is a little weird to me. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a bad thing. But hey, let's give it a shot. So I know how to do this, right? We've got our identification tools. We point, we click, and we find out the answer immediately. So I gave it a shot. Didn't work. Same trick, didn't work twice. I can't run it with that exact same option set and get the exact same answer, unfortunately. So we're going to have to do something a little more advanced, which is good. It's an opportunity for learning. So in this case, maybe we have more options. Maybe we've got a whole new menu of options that we can rely on and use. And this is where the Canoe Radio Companion comes in. I'm a huge fan of this tool because it lets you build little radio circuits very easily with this visual sort of block diagram where you can set inputs and outputs and know what's going on, and it'll create code for you that makes the software side of a software-defined radio. But you don't have to code. You can if you want to, obviously, and it's a great place to start if you get curious, but I think it's great. So I set up a basic diagram for this. It won't bite. I think when I started looking into these, there were diagrams that were just spaghetti everywhere, right? You've got 12 blocks and arrows everywhere, and you're not sure what's going on. This one's just got 5, 6, it's not too bad. Those 2 blocks in the corner, they always show up no matter what you do. They're just part of the standard diagram when you make a new file. And then you'll notice the RTL-SDR source in the middle right there. And this is the most important part. So this block translates, again, those 1s and 0s, those pulses, the short pulse, the long pulse, for what's showing up. And it shows it, it translates it into a way that the program can handle it. And then we can use that as an input for a couple different displays. On top, I've got the fast Fourier transform sync, which basically it's a bunch of math that makes it easier to see the amplitude at different frequencies. So you can see how strong signals are over a bigger range of frequencies instead of just looking at each individual thing and saying, is my signal here? Is my signal there? Is my signal here? And then below that, we've got the GUI scope sync, which gives us the perspective of time. So this will show for our center frequency what the amplitude is over time. So we can see, are there any pulses? Maybe we'll get to see that on-off keying I told you about, and you won't feel like it was a waste of time. That would be cool. You'll also notice off to the left, I've got what's called a GUI slider. So this is a type of variable, and this is one of the things that makes RTL-SDR great, is you can create a visual variable like this and say, I'd like the default value of my frequency, which in this case it's set to freak, to be 300 megahertz. And I'd like it to have a minimum of 300 and a maximum of 310. And then you can set the name of that variable, that FREQ, and you can put it into the RTL-SDR source, where it's asking for that channel 0 frequency, and you can put it into your FFT sync as well, for the baseband frequency. So you can't tell, since I'd have to double click and show you the settings, but in each of those blocks, it's not actually 300 megahertz I've set for that SDR source and that sync. I've set freak the variable instead, so we can tune around and try to figure out where our signal is. In this case, I've sort of done the cooking show, saved a little time again, and I've got some sort of suspicious hunch that the signal is between 300 and 310 megahertz. All you have to do once this is set up is press that arrow in the corner, that play, and you get something like this. So this is the real magic. Down at the bottom, we've got the FFT Sync, and you can see the strength of signals at different frequencies. I've got what's called the peak hold option here to hang on to what the strongest signals are. So instead of just showing it for an instance, it'll show me over a few different seconds the power of that signal. And when I push the button and I've got my FFT plot open, I can kind of see, it looks like there's a peak around 304.1 megahertz. You can see that I've tuned to that. Up at the top in the freak variable is set to 301 or 304.1 megahertz. And that little circle in the middle of the screen there is that slider that we set. So we can actually pull it back and forth. Like we've got our own radio tuner here that we made. This is ours. That's cool. And you can see the signal coming in at that frequency with, sure enough, longer pulses and shorter pulses showing the zeros and ones of the fan control. So if I was not a lazy person, right, I might take this opportunity to say, this is amazing. I've done it. I've got my own tuner. I can translate this on my own, and I'd get a paper and pen and sit down at my desk and write down every bit that came by as I push these buttons. But I'm still lazy, and we know where the frequency is now. So, lo and behold, I found a new flag on our old favorite tool, RTL-433. So here you can point it at a specific frequency and tell it where you want it to look. So before it was just confused. It didn't know, I'd say, hey, go find the signal, and it'd say, I'm not sure where. You're kind of giving me a whole world of data to look at. What do you want me to do? With this flag, the -F, I'm able to specify, I think I've got a hunch. This signal's around 304.1 megahertz. Can you translate there for me, please? And it will. So we've got the exact same setup as before. I can tabulate my results, figure out what makes the fan go faster and slower, the light go brighter and dimmer. That one was more complicated. But if you've got a remote like this at home, I'll leave that as an exercise to the reader. Since we've come full circle in our adventure, we've taken the first couple of steps outside of our starter town, found some wild signals, caught them, and gone home for the day. If any of this was interesting to you, Michael Osman has an amazing course with a lot of material in a similar vein with the HackRF. The HackRF is a more expensive software-defined radio that can transmit as well. It's a wonderful product, but you can also do a lot of that course material using a cheaper radio like this that only costs $30, like the RTL-SDR. Additionally, Sammy Kamkar is known for some wonderful, intriguing, just fun, mischievous research in this space. So if you're looking to continue the adventure in that sort of way, I'd definitely recommend looking into his materials. And if you're ever at a restaurant and you pick up something, it's a buzzer and it says FCC ID, whatever, it's a great opportunity to look that up. The FCC requires information to be published on all devices that are registered with it, so you can find out where a device transmits, what the test results look like. If you've got a company that's not as great on the OSINT front, they might actually reveal circuit schematics or something that you maybe wouldn't expect to see in there. So it's a fun tool as well, just for general investigation. And obviously, your own curiosity will lead you to the best adventures. So I won't try to limit what comes next. That's all I've got. Any questions?
You mentioned expensive. If you wanted to get into transmitting, what's like the lower bound?
So there's a couple good software-defined radios at what for traditional radio would be considered lower price points, so maybe in the $300 to $600 range. The HackRF is one of them. There's also the Blade RF. I know there's a lot of other software-defined radios in this space that might be cheaper than that, but I haven't played around with them too much yet. I definitely recommend, looking it up. There's good posts on what a good middle range receiver would be, but those are the first two I'd think of.
Other questions for Katie? There's one over there, I think. Greg, yeah.
Are there any legal issues around receiving? So for example, if I'm living in a crowded neighborhood with lots of neighbors, do I need to be worried if I'm playing with this stuff?
So there are, I do, if you're playing with radio things, I would be concerned, especially if you're looking into transmitting, to look into regulations first. Receiving, I've learned, has some peculiar regulations around it, so I wouldn't try to comment on all of them. There is the question of listening isn't necessarily a detectable act, but I definitely advise you to investigate, what the correct way of approaching that is.
I mean, neither of us is a lawyer. If there's a lawyer in the room, please feel free to comment on it. I'll tell you what my lawyer has told me. You can listen to anything, but if the transmitter has an expectation of privacy, you're not supposed to look at what you've received. Now, how can you know that? Well, if they've done some form of encryption to it, they expect it to be private. All right, well, is WEP some form of encryption? Because WEP isn't really very secure at all. This is a gray zone. So yes, you're allowed to receive anything, but can you actually look at what you've received? That's where things get a little weird, according to what my lawyers told me.
That's a wonderful way of putting it, though. Thank you. I wouldn't have been able to say it that well.
It's from Mark Rash.
I'll go over all my slides and cover my eyes. No, can't see them.
Katie, do you have any customers that are interested in this kind of analysis from a pen test perspective, or how are you communicating the risks associated with some of this stuff to people that are concerned about security for wireless signals in their organizations?
That's a great question. I haven't actually had the opportunity to do work in this space. This is something that interests me immensely, and that's also why I chose to emphasize that it's a great way to practice the hacker mindset. I think it's one of those spaces that's more difficult to get people to pay attention to because the tooling, the fact that you can't open up something like Metasploit just yet, right? It sounds like the hardware bridge might be making that a little easier in the future, but you can't open it and, run a payload, find vulnerable signals that are common in my environment. So I think it's a space that if it got more attention, it would be a lot easier to communicate those risks to people and test for those risks, but it's still got a little bit of development until it gets there.
Thank you.
I think we've got another question over here.
Oh, this guy's got it.
I do. Very excited to use that. So this is amazing. I mean, there's so many applications, so many different ways to utilize this technology. And from my perspective, how do I stop people from using it? Say if some guy's sitting out in front of my garage or my driveway, and he's just listening and records it, and then when I'm not home, he just pops into my garage and hops in, and no one's going to think twice about it. So for me, that's extremely concerning. Mm-hmm. What steps can I do to help prevent that from happening to me?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think so don't use the technologies I use in controlling my home, first of all. Let this be a lesson to you. I'll get home and my lights won't turn on. But yeah, I think be curious about what technologies you're implementing in your home. If you've got a garage door opener, some of them do have ways of dealing with that, but there are definitely vulnerabilities. And so it's about your local threat model, right? How much you trust your neighbors or the guy who's going to drive by your house with your garage door opener keys. And I think it's something that this is another area where I wish I had better advice to say, look for the stamp of security on all blessed home security RF products. But it's unfortunately not that simple. So I guess advise you to keep an open mind and be aware of the risk that some of these technologies might introduce to your home. I can probably handle if someone comes by my home and turns my lights on and off once a year maybe, but beyond that I might look into a more secure smart home solution. But yeah, I think that's what I'd try and do. Specifically for garage door openers, I know there has been some good research in that space, specifically by Sami Kamkar.
Very good. Any other questions for Katie? If not, let's give Katie a round of applause. Thank you, Katie. Awesome. Really good stuff.